Chosen one, don't scroll past this moment. Your spirit knows exactly why you're here. What you're about to hear isn't petty drama. It's prophetic justice in motion. It's the kind of spiritual turning point where the tables don't just turn. They flip in slow motion while heaven applauds. If you've ever been underestimated, mocked, or falsely accused by someone who mistook volume for value, this one's for you. And before we go any further, thank you. Yes, you, every beautiful soul who's supported this mission through super thanks, prayers, shares, and just by showing up with your faith intact. You are the lifeblood of this sacred space, and I don't take your presence for granted. Comment 777 if your spirit already knows this word is about to confirm something you already discerned in silence. This isn't just a recap, it's an unfolding. That moment when the loudest mouth in the room got hit with the deafening sound of your alignment. They expected you to break. Instead, you stood there, anointed, unbothered, and dangerous in your stillness. What does it look like when the one who mocked you runs out of jokes? What does it sound like when their own echo turns into their downfall? Keep watching. This is more than memory. It's prophecy made visible. And this next part, it's the moment the whole room remembered your name. Not because you demanded it, but because heaven endorsed it. Let's get into it. God's chosen ones, the moment you silenced that arrogant clown, everyone froze. You didn't raise your voice because your silence was a weapon crafted in heaven. You didn't clap back because your restraint wasn't weakness, it was warfare. While they were busy putting on a theatrical display of pride and noise, you remained still. And that stillness, it wasn't passive, it was nuclear. It dismantled their stage with the precision of a surgeon. You didn't throw a single verbal stone, and yet the structure of their ego collapsed in front of everyone like a cathedral built on sand. Why did the room go silent when you said nothing? Why did the laughter turn into coughs, the applause into fidgeting, the cheer into shame? Because the moment you withheld your energy, the frequency of truth disrupted the entire performance. That wasn't just maturity, it was mastery. The book of Proverbs says, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." Proverbs 29:11. You didn't argue because you weren't sent to participate in their circus. You were sent to expose it. Like Christ before Pilate, who refused to dignify empty accusations with a response. You stood in kingdom composure while the arrogant clown unraveled under the weight of their own delusions. And isn't that how spiritual authority often moves? Quietly, deliberately, letting the enemy swing wide until they fall on their own momentum. They wanted an audience, but what they didn't expect was for the audience to see through them. The loud voice, the exaggerated confidence, the performative outrage, all of it was architecture built on insecurity. And when you didn't clap, you didn't just rob them of applause, you collapsed the illusion. Isn't it strange how performance requires participation to remain powerful? The moment you starved the spectacle, the stage lights began to flicker, and suddenly what was once mesmerizing became embarrassing. Like the northern lights, beautiful, yes, but only when observed in silence. Your presence forced everyone to finally see what had been disguised by sound and speed. What do you do when someone demands your reaction and you give them none? What happens when a person builds their identity off opposition and you stop giving them access? You created a vacuum, a sacred absence, and the echo of their own noise was louder than any insult you could have crafted. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you, in judgment you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. But in your case, heaven didn't need your rebuttal. Your peace condemned the lie. Psychologically, this moment triggered cognitive dissonance in everyone watching. The mind naturally resists holding two opposing truths. So when the crowd saw your calm against their chaos, their brains began re-evaluating everything they once believed. Was the clown really confident or just loud? Were you ever truly weak or just wise? You created what behavioral psychologists call a mirrored collapse, where an unstable ego, deprived of response, folds inward on itself. This is what happened to Lucien, a young, ambitious man who ran a startup with charisma but belittled everyone in meetings to prove dominance. For months, people clapped, laughed, tolerated, but then his quiet intern, Maya, stopped reacting. No eye rolls, no defense, no counter comments, just stillness. One by one, the team followed suit. Lucien's jokes turned awkward. His temper began to flare. His investors withdrew. Within a quarter, the board replaced him. Maya never said a word, but she silenced the tyrant. In Scripture, we see this mirrored in the downfall of Haman. He plotted, he paraded, he performed, until Queen Esther, through divine strategy, allowed his own trap to become his undoing. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Esther 7:10. You let them build the rope. You gave them space, and it undid them. Visualize a predator plant like the Venus flytrap. It opens wide, vibrant and still, waiting for movement. But when no stimulation arrives, it closes in frustration and begins to wilt. You denied them the fuel of reaction, and that denial became divine judgment. Even the Pope once remarked, "Silence is sometimes the most powerful cry." You became that cry, not through noise but through posture, through the refusal to descend, through the decision to let heaven's justice echo louder than your own voice. Meanwhile, arrogant men like Adam Neumann, former CEO of WeWork, became modern examples of ego-fueled implosion. A charismatic visionary, yes, but behind the scenes, exploitation, manipulation, unchecked pride. He spoke endlessly, deflected criticism, mocked restraint. Until the empire cracked, investors fled, and his billion-dollar dream dissolved in scandal. The mic he held became the sword that cut him down. You watched a similar moment unfold. A person who believed their charm could cover their cruelty, who used laughter as a weapon and spotlight as armor. But what happens when the lights fade, when the crowd looks closer, when the illusion meets the truth? How long can someone perform before their real frequency leaks through? How long can a mask last under the scrutiny of silence? What happens when someone built to dominate dialogue is forced to exist in stillness? You orchestrated that confrontation without ever lifting a hand. And when the moment came, when the faces around you shifted, the mood dropped, the energy cracked, everyone finally saw it. Not your anger, not your pain, but your clarity, your discipline, your authority. You moved like someone who already read the script and knew exactly how it would end. Because you did. They craved applause like oxygen, didn't they? Every word they spoke, every exaggerated laugh, every theatrical entrance, they were performing, not living. Their charisma wasn't rooted in confidence, but in desperation. They were playing to the crowd, feeding off shallow validation, hoping that loudness would be mistaken for leadership. And while they thrived on the shifting sands of perception, you were moving on bedrock. You walked in rooms not to impress, but to align. And alignment, chosen one, cannot be manufactured. It can only be cultivated in the quiet chambers of discipline, prayer, and divine resonance. So why did their voice grow louder every time you entered the room? Why did their jokes aim sharper, their body language get bigger, their presence more demanding? Because even without speaking, your energy disrupted their illusion. Even without trying, your stillness announced something their ego couldn't compete with. And deep down they knew, authority doesn't perform, it emanates. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Isaiah 43:2. This wasn't just about confidence, it was about frequency. They were broadcasting insecurity at a high volume. But you were resonating with a frequency that only heaven could author. They cracked jokes at your expense, but every punchline only revealed the hollowness behind their smile. And when the moment came, when the tension finally gave way to truth, it wasn't your words that shattered the illusion. It was your weight. The kind of weight only carried by someone who has survived fire, wilderness, and war, and came back glowing. Take the story of Daniel. The satraps and administrators were threatened by his excellence, so they plotted to take him down with public spectacle. Yet when Daniel stood, he didn't yell, perform, or beg for attention. He simply aligned with God. And when the lions couldn't consume him, the room froze. The power shifted. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel." Daniel 6:25-26. One man's authority silenced a nation's mockery. But what does that look like today? In a small creative agency, a young designer named Alethea worked silently, consistently producing visionary work that transformed brands. Her manager, Lucas, a charming, extroverted man, routinely stole credit, made sly remarks in meetings, and manipulated the narrative to elevate himself. People laughed at his jabs. They clapped when he made bold pitches. But over time, the clients noticed something. The brilliance they praised never came from his hand. It was Alethea's quiet excellence, her unwavering energy, that built the success. One client requested her directly, then another, then the board. Within months, Lucas was out. Alethea never fought. She just never stopped being excellent. The room didn't shift because of confrontation. It shifted because truth walked in wearing quiet shoes. And in nature, you see this mirrored in the tectonic plates, those unseen foundations beneath the Earth's surface. They move in silence, yet when their alignment is disrupted, the entire world trembles. Earthquakes aren't loud until they break through. And you, chosen one, you are tectonic. Not flashy, not loud, but world-shifting when divine timing strikes. While they danced for attention, you stood in your assignment. And what about real life? Look at the legacy of Pope John Paul II, a man of deep conviction who never sought the spotlight, but through calm persistence and spiritual clarity, reshaped history. He didn't roar, he resonated, and millions felt it. Contrast that with a figure like Elizabeth Holmes, once hailed as the next Steve Jobs, her confidence crafted through sleek branding and persuasive performances. But as scrutiny came, the illusion cracked. Her empire collapsed, because the truth doesn't bend to applause, it waits for exposure. Isn't that what happened with you? They tried to control the room with noise. But how do you control a storm that doesn't respond to wind? How do you outshine a presence that doesn't require spotlight? What do you do when someone refuses to compete? Because they've already won in realms you can't fake. They tried to mock you into shrinking, but how do you embarrass someone who isn't performing? How do you destabilize someone who's not plugged into the same circuit of approval? Their power was borrowed from audience reaction, from public image, from distraction. Yours was built in the quiet, in obedience, in isolation, in divine alignment. And when the spotlight flickered, their mask slipped. That's when the audience finally saw the difference. Their charisma was clever, but your clarity, it was crushing. You didn't ask for respect, it followed you. You didn't announce your crown, you wore it invisibly, and heaven made sure it gleamed when the moment came. That's the mystery of real authority. It moves subtly until it moves everything, and that's what humiliated them. They weren't prepared for truth to be so still. They weren't ready for a presence so unmoved that it became a mirror, reflecting every crack in their illusion. So when the applause died, when the room stopped echoing with laughter, it wasn't because you said anything, it was because you didn't have to. There's a unique silence that falls over a room when imitation stands face to face with authenticity, and that silence, you caused it without even trying. You weren't dressed for performance. You weren't adorned with bravado or fueled by applause. You didn't walk in craving attention. You simply embodied what they had been pretending to be all along. That's what ruptured their illusion. That's what made them panic. Because everything they'd been trying to sell, you already carried by nature. They didn't expect their costume to unravel just because someone real walked in. But that's what happens when frequency meets counterfeit. The contrast becomes unbearable. They had spent so long crafting a persona: loud voice, dominant posture, calculated wisdom, borrowed confidence. But it was all scaffolding, an architectural shell designed to look sturdy from a distance, but hollow under pressure. And when you entered the atmosphere, you didn't speak to impress, you didn't perform to dominate, you simply were. And the vibration of your authenticity shook loose every lie they had been using as scaffolding. What happens when someone is mimicking strength while another is strength? What happens when the room finally notices the difference between practiced presence and divine alignment? Their performance didn't fail because you interrupted it. It failed because truth, when it arrives, makes pretense intolerable. Wisdom calls aloud in the street. She raises her voice in the public squares. Proverbs 1:20. But your wisdom didn't scream, it radiated. You didn't compete with their noise because you didn't need to. Heaven had already validated you in secret. You were moving in truth, not tactics. Like Moses, who came down from Mount Sinai, not with empty declarations, but with his face literally glowing from time with God. Exodus 34:29. He didn't announce himself, he didn't brag. But the people trembled, not because of what he said, but because of what he had become. You carried that same radiation, chosen one. Not one you could fake, not one you could rehearse, but one forged in silence, obedience, and heavenly fire. So what broke the illusion for them? Was it your posture, or the fact that you never needed to posture in the first place? Was it your words, or the fact that you didn't rely on them to prove anything? You see it in the downfall of Adam Levine's carefully curated image, pop star, frontman, seemingly in control. But when allegations of manipulation surfaced, the charm cracked, the smile faded, because no amount of charisma can mask duplicity when integrity enters the room. The audience shifted, not because of loud accusations, but because of visible inconsistency. And this dynamic played out again when Alondra, a behavioral therapist from San Diego, attended her company's leadership retreat. One of the senior team members, Raymond, often dominated conversations with philosophical jargon and feigned confidence. But when Alondra quietly offered insights rooted in lived wisdom, empathy, and strategic clarity, the room leaned toward her without force. Raymond's energy started unraveling. The harder he tried to reassert his relevance, the more out of sync he appeared. By the end of the retreat, leadership invited Alondra to lead internal mentorship programs. Raymond didn't lose his voice because she attacked him. He lost it because the room discovered something better. In nature, this principle holds true. A peacock may spread its feathers wide to attract attention, but when a hawk lands silently nearby, the spectacle loses all meaning. The bird whose beauty relies on performance cannot compete with the creature who commands presence without noise. That was you. You were the hawk, not flamboyant, but undeniable. Let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. Proverbs 27:2. And that's exactly what happened. You never had to campaign for respect. It found you on its own. Their applause began to shift directions, and they couldn't stop it. Theologians often describe this as ontological weight, the felt presence of a being that is deeply rooted in identity, not role. And when someone with ontological weight walks into a space, pretense can't breathe. That's why their jokes fell flat. That's why their swagger dissolved. That's why the air shifted. And that's why it stung. They weren't just embarrassed by you, they were exposed by you. They spent years building a stage, choreographing their moves, mastering their voice. But the truth is, they were always auditioning for a role they were never meant to play. And when the real thing showed up, the curtain dropped. Their act fell apart, not because you tore it down, but because your presence made the act look ridiculous. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. That's what heaven always saw in you, and now earth is catching up. So what happens when a mirror refuses to lie? What do you do when the reflection shows you're not the one they thought was weak, you're the one they can never replicate? You didn't just survive their jealousy, you reframed the entire scene, without lifting a finger, without throwing shade, without needing an audience to see it happen. But they saw it. Oh, they saw it. The unsettling part? You didn't try to win, you weren't even playing the same game. And yet your calm dismantled their chaos. Your stillness turned into strategy. And your presence, it became a mirror, one they couldn't avoid. So when they looked into that mirror, what did they see? A person trying to copy a version of you they could never become. A self-made mask, slipping inch by inch. An empire built on impressions, crumbling in the face of someone who no longer needed to impress. It wasn't vengeance, it was revelation. And revelation never misses. You didn't just witness a fall, you triggered a cleansing. And you didn't even have to lift a finger. There they were, a confident crew moving like a synchronized wave of smug superiority, orbiting their leader like he was invincible. Every entrance you made used to spark the same rehearsed ritual. Snickers behind screens, bold stares masking fear, subtle jabs dressed as jokes. The loyalty they displayed wasn't rooted in truth. It was borrowed authority. They weren't backing wisdom, they were parroting dominance. And all it took was one crack, one undeniable unveiling of truth, and the entire dynamic imploded. When pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 11:2. They followed someone not because he was worthy, but because he was loud. But what happens when volume can no longer mask vacancy? What happens when borrowed boldness is put on trial by undeniable presence? The room shifted when their so-called leader started to unravel. You didn't interrupt, you didn't accuse, you didn't play their game, but divine timing did. And when it came, it was surgical. One misplaced sentence, one moment of exposed contradiction, one silent glance from you, and the false narrative collapsed like a failed bridge under its own weight. Why did their leader start stammering when truth arrived? Why did the crew, once so bold, suddenly stare at the floor, avoiding eye contact with one another? Because cognitive dissonance is violent when collective illusion meets undeniable revelation. And this is exactly what happened to Saul, the first king of Israel. He started strong, handsome, chosen by the people, but his ego grew louder than his obedience. He feared being outshined. He feared silence. And when David, young, soft-spoken, anointed, stepped into the battlefield with nothing but trust and a sling, Saul's authority cracked. His crew, once loyal soldiers, began to see the difference. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. 1 Samuel 18:7. A single moment of clarity undid the illusion of power. That's what you carried into that space. a spiritual resonance that didn't shout but vibrated through every wall of pretense. They laughed because they thought they knew the hierarchy. They didn't realize heaven had rewritten the blueprint, and you were the new architecture. Look at Nelson Mandela, a man once mocked, isolated, stripped of earthly power. But after years of silent conviction, when the truth of his integrity was finally revealed, the system that mocked him crumbled. His captors became witnesses, his enemies became footnotes. His truth outlived their power plays. And in contrast, think of Billy McFarland, the man behind the infamous Fire Festival, a charismatic leader with bold ideas, a confident crew, and blind followers who believed in his illusion. But when reality hit, it hit hard. His team scattered, investors pulled out, his kingdom of hype disintegrated. He wasn't just exposed, he was evicted. Not just physically, but morally, socially, spiritually. You didn't just see this play out, you catalyzed it. In a small non-profit office in Chicago, Maris had always been the one targeted. Quiet, intuitive, consistent. Her director, Garrett, ran the department like a personality cult. His team of 5 mirrored his arrogance, enforcing his ego like spiritual bodyguards. But one day, during a budget meeting, Maris calmly laid out a timeline of discrepancies. No anger, no shade, just facts, receipts. The silence that followed was volcanic. Garrett deflected, panicked, tried to joke, but no one laughed. His followers looked at him differently. Within weeks, he resigned. 2 of his inner circle apologized to Maris. A third broke down in tears, confessing she'd always known something was wrong. You didn't just dismantle a man, you deconstructed a false system. In nature, this pattern echoes. Termite queens rule in darkness, surrounded by a colony trained to protect. But when a shaft of sunlight breaks through the wood, the structure disintegrates. The workers scatter. The queen is no longer shielded and decay becomes visible. Light doesn't scream, it exposes. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Ephesians 5:11. The spiritual truth is this: they were not just embarrassed, they were spiritually evicted. Their authority had expired, but they kept performing as if the lease hadn't been terminated. But heaven issued a notice, and you were the mail carrier. Why did their supporters start avoiding their calls? Why did the jokes stop mid-sentence? Why did their confidence evaporate so suddenly? Because loyalty, when built on illusion, cannot survive truth. The crew that once moved as one now moved in confusion. Discomfort replaced agreement. The energy died without you having to touch it. That's not revenge. That's the sound of divine alignment snapping the bones of counterfeit influence. The wise inherit honor, but fools get only shame. Proverbs 3:35. And shame, when it arrives unannounced, doesn't just stain the leader. It spills across the ones who followed blindly. They mocked the wrong one. They thought the quiet one was controllable. But heaven has always favored the underestimated. The battle belonged to the Lord, and the Lord has vindicated you. The truth isn't just on the table now, it's the table, and you're seated at it. In peace, in power, in prophetic authority, the one they laughed at, that's the one heaven backed. You didn't destroy them, truth did. You didn't orchestrate their downfall, you simply refused to disappear. And while they invested every ounce of energy into crafting your collapse, you kept showing up with nothing but integrity, patience, and terrifying consistency. They built lies like walls, hoping you'd suffocate inside them. They manipulated perceptions with the precision of illusionists, twisting facts, poisoning conversations, engineering false consensus. Why? Because they never thought you'd survive long enough for the truth to outlive the performance. But you did. You survived the storm without ever raising your voice. You walked through their fire, not untouched, but undestroyed. You didn't clap back. You didn't retaliate. You let time do what time always does when partnered with truth. It exposes architecture built on falsehood. What happens when a lie is forced to coexist with unshaken peace? What happens when the narrative collapses under the weight of time? As the prophet Isaiah once declared, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." Isaiah 54:17. But in your case, you didn't even speak the condemnation. Your endurance did, your peace did, your presence did. Each time they rehearsed the script that painted you as the villain, your silence became their contradiction. Every step you took in quiet obedience began to echo louder than their accusations. Every moment you remained unbothered was a tectonic shift in the narrative. Just as Jesus stood silent before Pilate, Matthew 27:14, refusing to defend himself against false testimony, you too chose divine restraint. And what was the result? The crowd that once mocked began to question. The audience that cheered them on began to notice cracks in the story. Why were they so nervous if you were the threat? Why did their energy feel rehearsed, strained, and increasingly fragile? And here's the deeper truth. Lies are like parasites. They require the absence of light to survive. But your presence, anchored in divine truth, became sunlight. You didn't burn them, you revealed them. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1:5. Even psychologists have studied the impact of emotional dissonance. When someone's outward confidence contradicts the undercurrent of insecurity they can't hide. You were their contradiction. Your calm began to betray their chaos. Your consistency disrupted their credibility. You became their mirror. And what happens when a mirror doesn't reflect what you want to believe? It becomes a source of shame, embarrassment, exposure. That's what happened to Darren, CEO of a tech startup who built his brand on charisma and curated quotes. Behind closed doors, he sabotaged employees he saw as competition. He targeted his lead designer, Ava, with subtle lies, positioning her as unstable. But Ava never retaliated. She just kept delivering excellent work, kept being steady, kept showing up. Eventually, clients started requesting her by name. Investors questioned internal dynamics. Darren cracked. His inconsistencies became visible. His team left. Ava didn't just survive the setup, she outlived it. Isn't that exactly what you did? Like the basalt cliffs carved by millennia of crashing waves, your resilience wasn't loud, it was geological. While others eroded with every opinion, you held your form. You were not shaped by applause or public perception, but by time, pressure, and divine design. The more their narratives beat against you, the more your authority stood out, not because you resisted, but because you endured. Eventually it became clear, you weren't just standing, you were immovable. Even in the scriptures we see this principle at work. Haman didn't die because Esther accused him. He died because he constructed his own gallows. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Esther 7:10. That's not revenge. That's divine geometry, where the equation of truth always balances eventually. You didn't need to argue because your survival was the rebuttal. And what about Martin Luther King Jr.? He didn't scream back at those who spit venom. He walked, he marched, he endured. And while his enemies raged, time revealed who was truly built to last. The oppressors are remembered in shame. He is remembered in glory. They assumed you'd fold before the mask slipped. But every time you showed up with dignity, their hands shook. Every time you remained unshaken, their version of reality crumbled a little more. Why did they grow more erratic as you grew more peaceful? Why did their story require constant updates while your character remained steady? Because truth doesn't evolve, it emerges. And when it does, it doesn't scream, it stands. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist. Ephesians 6:14. You didn't destroy them with words. You dismantled their illusion by existing in peace longer than they thought possible. And now, the truth isn't a whisper, it's a roar. Not because you raised it, but because God did. They tried to define you through destruction. But now, the same people they recruited are watching you walk whole, watching you walk free, watching you walk blessed. That's not revenge. That's the justice of heaven dressing you in vindication. They made your name the punchline, but heaven rewrote the punchline into a prophecy. For the longest time, your presence was their entertainment. Every room they entered, every conversation they hijacked, there it was, again, your name, their smirk, and the echo of cheap laughter. But what they never understood was this: when you mock what God has chosen, you don't just offend a person, you activate a divine reversal. They used your past like a weapon, didn't they? Your awkwardness, your softness, your silence, your peculiarities. They pointed at those things as flaws. But what if those weren't flaws? What if they were codes written into your story to conceal the magnitude of your destiny until the right time? What if the very things they mocked were the markers of your anointing? But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. 1 Corinthians 1:27. They didn't just underestimate you, they misread the genre of your story. They thought they were watching a comedy. But heaven had scripted a divine drama with you as the plot twist. And by the time the narrative flipped, they weren't just embarrassed, they were irrelevant. Because while they were turning your name into a punchline, God was turning your silence into a setup. You never had to clap back. You never had to interrupt. You simply became. And what you became silenced every laugh, every whisper, every low-effort insult. They kept repeating the same old joke, thinking the world hadn't changed. But it had. And now, the audience was no longer laughing. They were looking at them with raised eyebrows and tightened lips. He who digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. Proverbs 26:27. What does it feel like when the very cruelty someone weaponized becomes the script of their own collapse? What happens when someone builds their whole identity around mocking yours and the world suddenly wakes up? That's what happened when the tides turned. In the story of Joseph, his brothers threw him into a pit, mocked his dreams, sold him like a problem to be erased. But when famine came and truth reigned, they stood before the one they once mocked, begging for mercy. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. Genesis 50:20. That wasn't just redemption. That was divine storytelling. And your story carried that same pattern. They wrote you off, but God redrafted the page. Think of comedian Hannah Gadsby, once ridiculed for her unconventional delivery, for her quiet, trauma-infused narratives that didn't fit mainstream formats. But she didn't shift for applause. She stayed true. Then Nanette happened. The very things they told her made her unfunny. Her depth, her pain, her complexity became the reason the world leaned in. The critics became footnotes. The punchline became the platform. Now contrast that with someone like Harvey Weinstein. For years he mocked boundaries, dismissed pain, and wielded power with cruelty cloaked in charisma. He laughed in private rooms while others suffered silently. But the world shifted. The curtain lifted. The audience turned, and now he's not feared. He's pitied, not respected, erased. You didn't plan for revenge. You simply stayed aligned. And when the story pivoted, it wasn't because you screamed. It was because divine timing does not miss a beat. In a rural town in Maine, there lived a woman named Claire who ran a small antique shop. For years, she was mocked by a group of social elites for her old clothes, her quiet demeanor, and her belief in prophetic dreams. They called her Ghost Lady. Teenagers made videos mocking her. But one day, a storm tore through the town. Power grids failed. Internet went down. The only safe building left standing was Claire's, fortified with old stone, wood, and wisdom. She opened her doors. That same mocking crowd. They came in trembling, and Claire, with a quiet smile, lit her oil lamps and served them tea. She never had to say a word. The story said it for her, and nature itself holds this mystery. The octopus, a creature often joked about in cartoons for looking strange, has more neurological complexity than nearly any animal on Earth. It can edit its own RNA, camouflage flawlessly, and solve puzzles humans still don't fully understand. Misjudged, misunderstood, but brilliant in silence. That was you. Not flashy, not obvious, but operating on a level they were never wired to grasp. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Psalm 118, verse 22. Why were they so loud when mocking you, but so quiet now that truth has taken the mic? Why did their energy shift the moment you entered with peace and presence instead of proof? Why does their laughter now sound hollow? Because cruelty only survives in ignorance. But when wisdom walks in, the air changes. You were never the fool. You were the forerunner. You were never irrelevant. You were hidden for divine unveiling. You didn't need a bigger voice. You needed a longer timeline. And now that the timeline has matured, everyone is seeing what heaven saw all along. They made you the punchline, but God made you the plot twist. And no one's laughing now, not because you struck back, but because truth walked on stage wearing your name. You need to understand something, chosen one. What happened to them wasn't just awkward. It wasn't just a moment of public failure or a misstep that made the room uncomfortable. It was cosmic collapse, a spiritual shutdown, an invisible courtroom issuing a visible verdict. The humiliation they experienced didn't begin in the natural realm. It was initiated in the heavenlies. That wasn't just a bad day. It was divine justice, perfectly timed, surgically executed. They didn't just lose influence, they lost access. For a long time they walked around like they were glowing, but it wasn't their own light. It was a reflection, a mirror ball illusion that only worked in dark rooms with no truth present. They spoke with swagger that was stitched together from borrowed personas, from mimicry, from manipulation, and while it looked convincing, it was always hollow. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Isaiah 5:20. That's what they built, a reversal, a distortion. But distortion can only last so long in the presence of clarity. And the moment you stood still in truth, their illusion had nowhere left to hide. Have you ever felt an atmosphere shift, not because of a storm outside, but because something unholy was just unseated? That's what happened. Their voice cracked, their confidence buckled, and the silence in the room didn't feel neutral. It felt judgmental, and not from people, from the unseen. Why did their jokes stop working? Why did their charisma suddenly feel like static? Why did the very energy they used to dominate with begin to repel others? Because a verdict had been passed. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. They were operating on stolen energy, spiritual theft, pretending to walk in light, when in fact they were cloaked in shadow. And when that expiration date came, heaven didn't need fire or lightning to end it. Heaven simply withdrew. And when heaven backs away, everything collapses. Just ask King Nebuchadnezzar, once the most powerful ruler on earth, whose ego reached so high it pierced the heavens. God warned him. He ignored it. Until one day, mid-sentence, mid-glory, he was struck down by divine decree. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away and ate grass like the ox. Daniel 4:33. That wasn't just punishment. That was a divine interruption of illusion. In modern times, we saw a similar unraveling with Harvey Weinstein, a film mogul who abused power, manipulated systems, and built an empire off fear and silence. He seemed untouchable, until one moment shattered the facade. One testimony, one crack. And then, like a flood, the narrative broke. Not because people got louder, but because the truth woke up. Weinstein didn't just lose his reputation, he was spiritually evicted from influence. The same pattern unfolded in a smaller, yet equally powerful way in the life of Brenna, a young woman working in ministry. Her director, Marcellus, known for his eloquent preaching and public compassion, privately shamed her, sabotaged her ideas, and gaslit her loyalty. For years, people saw him as a father figure in the faith. Until one silent Sunday, as he prepared to speak, something shifted. He couldn't find the words. His mouth stammered, his energy shriveled. The sermon never landed, no scandal, no confrontation. But within weeks, attendance dropped, questions rose, and the board quietly transitioned him out. Brenna never said a word, but the heavens had. It wasn't her voice that moved him. It was divine withdrawal. You were standing in that same current, weren't you? You felt it. The temperature drop, the room lose focus. The eyes that once admired now blinked in confusion. That's because the illusion died. Not with a bang, but with a vacuum. A holy void. And the natural world knows this too. Look at the anglerfish, a deep-sea predator that glows in the darkness to lure its prey. Its light is not its own. It's bacterial, a false beacon. But when the environment changes, when light from above reaches the depths, the anglerfish becomes powerless, exposed, absurd. That's what happened to them. The light from above finally pierced the deep. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. Luke 12:2. You didn't have to expose them. The atmosphere did. You didn't have to clap back. The courtroom of heaven already rendered a verdict. You didn't dismantle their influence. The plug was pulled on borrowed power, and the stage went black. So why do they walk differently now? Why do they speak with hesitation, avoid your eyes, retreat from the very spotlight they once craved? Because something left them. They don't know how to explain it, but you do. The mantle they pretended to carry was revoked. The illusion they curated was cancelled. They didn't just lose reputation, they lost spiritual coverage. That wasn't embarrassment, that was eviction. And heaven made sure it echoed. They thought your silence was surrender. They mistook your calm demeanor for defeat. But what they couldn't see, what their eyes were too carnal to discern, was that your restraint wasn't human, it was holy. You didn't stay silent because you lacked words. You stayed silent because you had access to a courtroom they didn't know existed. Your stillness wasn't an absence of strength. It was evidence of spiritual jurisdiction. You stood there, calm as glass, while storms swirled around you. But like a dam engineered by divine architecture, you held back the flood that could have drowned their credibility in seconds. Why didn't you release what you knew? Why didn't you reveal the screenshots, the voice memos, the receipts that could have brought them to their knees? Why didn't you retaliate the way everyone expected you to? Because heaven whispered to your soul, "Be still." Not out of passivity, but out of posture. Not out of fear, but out of frequency. Jesus, during his trial, stood in silence before Pilate, Matthew 27:14. Even though he held all power to call down legions of angels. That was not weakness, it was strategic surrender to the will of the Father. He knew that some verdicts must come from above, not from the crowd. And you knew it too. That same spirit rested on you. And just like Jesus' silence didn't delay the resurrection, your quietness didn't delay your vindication. It accelerated it. Have you noticed how their confidence collapsed, not in days, but in moments? Have you watched someone unravel publicly while you didn't have to say a word? Have you ever witnessed the unraveling of arrogance that once seemed invincible? That's because when you're aligned with divine timing, justice doesn't shout, it echoes. The case of Dieter Rams, the legendary German industrial designer who said, "Good design is as little design as possible." His minimalism redefined modern aesthetics. But what people forget is how he watched lesser designers plagiarize his work and mock his principles until the market shifted and exposed their lack of substance. Rams didn't clap back. He just kept building in silence, and now his legacy outlives theirs. That's what divine restraint looks like in motion. In contrast, Bernie Madoff, a former investment advisor once trusted by the elite of Wall Street, projected unwavering confidence as he operated the largest Ponzi scheme in history. His downfall came not through confrontation, but through quiet investigation. The exposure didn't just bankrupt portfolios, it destroyed lives. His public collapse wasn't loud in tone, but seismic in consequence. He died in prison, stripped not just of status, but of significance. False confidence eventually implodes under its own weight. Your silence, on the other hand, was sacred. It wasn't empty, it was encoded with heaven's algorithms. There's a principle in physics called potential energy. It's stored power, not visible yet, but capable of release when the time is right. You were like a bowstring pulled back, not weak but charged. You didn't react because you were reserved for release. Take the example of Alma Reyes, a quiet woman who worked in human resources at a global firm. She discovered major corruption in her department, but said nothing, not out of fear, but because she was waiting for the appointed hour. When the whistle finally blew, she wasn't the one who sounded it. It was a compliance audit that confirmed everything. Alma's name was cleared, and she was promoted to Global Ethics Officer. She didn't push her way to justice. She aligned herself with it, and nature confirms this rhythm. The snow leopard, elusive and majestic, does not roar like lions. It stalks in silence, strikes with precision, and rules its terrain without fanfare. You move like that. Hidden but holy, unseen but undefeated. Why do you think people froze the moment your adversary crumbled? Why was the room so quiet? Even the ones who supported them said nothing. Why did it feel like time slowed down, as if creation itself was watching? Because the atmosphere recognized what just happened wasn't mere embarrassment. It was divine dismantling, a reconfiguration of power, a holy subtraction of influence. Your enemies didn't just lose followers, they lost credibility in dimensions they cannot repair. That moment wasn't viral, it was vibrational. The resonance of that silence still shakes rooms they enter. Their name doesn't hit the same, their presence doesn't feel the same, because spiritual bruising leaves a mark reputation can't cover. Psalm 46:10 declares, "Be still and know that I am God." That's not just a call to peace, it's a command for divine confidence. You obeyed it, and your stillness carried the weight of the throne. You didn't defeat them with sarcasm, you didn't destroy them with wit. You let the truth become a wave, and now they're drowning in the ripple effects of their own deception. They thought you were silent because you were scared, but really, you were strategic, and now the verdict is sealed. They didn't just cross you, they collided with someone who carries the courtroom of heaven. And as for you, you didn't just survive, you outlasted them, gracefully, quietly, righteously. You didn't win with noise, you won with authority. You didn't speak because your silence was the sentence. They didn't just enter the room, they entered like actors walking onto a stage. They carried a smirk like a prop, sarcasm like a script, and pride like a spotlight. They rehearsed their lines beforehand, imagining the laughs, the approval, the claps. They expected the crowd to join in mocking you. They assumed this would be their viral moment, the one where they'd finally break you down, humiliate you publicly, and turn your dignity into a punchline. But what happens when the script they wrote meets a stage they don't control? What they didn't anticipate was the shift, the kind of silence that descends not from boredom, but from the collapse of illusion. Have you ever been in a room where cruelty was supposed to be funny, but no one laughed? Where the air turned thick with spiritual resistance? Where the joke didn't land because it wasn't a joke, it was an attempted assassination of your character? Why did the mood sour so quickly? Why did people who used to laugh with them suddenly glance at the floor? Because mocking a chosen one always backfires in divine time. In Matthew 12:36, Jesus warned, "Everyone will have to give account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken." That moment wasn't empty, it was recorded, not by cameras, but by heaven. And when the book is opened, even sarcasm gets read aloud. They tried to weaponize humor, but the audience saw through it, because charisma without character is dangerous, and humor without holiness always dissolves into harm. You didn't flinch, you didn't fold. You simply stood there. And that silence turned into a courtroom. They didn't know you were not alone, that angels were in attendance, that spiritual frequencies were already shifting the atmosphere before their words even finished forming. Have you ever witnessed pride combust in public? Have you seen someone's entire facade collapse in front of the very people they tried to impress? What makes a room turn against someone mid-sentence? Why does heaven sometimes respond with silence that feels heavier than thunder? John Galliano, once hailed as a fashion genius at Dior, in 2011 he launched into a drunken, hateful rant in public, mocking, ridiculing and demeaning others with venom disguised as flair. He expected his reputation to shield him, but instead of applause, he got a global outcry. Dior cut ties. His name became a cautionary tale overnight. His ego crafted a stage, but truth tore the curtains down. That moment didn't elevate him. It ended an era. And it wasn't outrage that ruined him. It was exposure. Now contrast that with Raymond Tai, a quiet professor at a small liberal arts college. During a heated academic panel, another scholar mocked his research on compassion-based leadership, calling it utopian fluff. Raymond didn't respond. Instead, he calmly shared his data and quietly left the podium. Months later, his work was cited by multiple national institutes and invited into policy discussions. His silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom waiting for resonance. And in nature, this pattern persists. The mimic octopus, often mistaken for something small or weak, shapeshifts to avoid threats. But when it's truly provoked, it doesn't lash out. It vanishes into the depths, leaving the predator bewildered, disoriented by its own assumptions. You moved like that. You didn't retaliate. You realigned. And when you vanished from their narrative, the weight of your absence exposed their emptiness. Why did their voice crack halfway through the insult? Why did the crowd lean back instead of lean in? Why did their jokes feel like echoes in a room where heaven had already withdrawn its endorsement? Because judgment sometimes walks in quietly, but when it lands, it reverberates like thunder under your ribs. Romans 14:11 says, "Every knee will bow and every tongue will acknowledge God." And sometimes that acknowledgement doesn't come in a sanctuary. It comes in the dead silence of a social collapse. That day, they didn't lose a debate. They lost alignment. Their influence evaporated, not because you fought back, but because you didn't need to. You didn't need applause. You didn't need revenge. You just needed to stay in frequency. And that frequency rewrote the energy of the entire room. They came to entertain, but instead performed their own undoing. They wanted the spotlight, but ended up burning under it. That mic, it wasn't dropped. It was revoked by something far more powerful than applause. Divine judgment didn't yell. It whispered, and the whisper said, "This act is over." And as for you, you walked away crowned with silence and robed in relevance, not because of how loud you were, but because of how aligned you stayed. That silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred. It wasn't hesitation, It was heaven's final line. They misjudged you from the beginning, not because you lacked strength, but because you didn't flaunt it. In their shallow equations, volume equaled value. Intensity meant influence. Decibels defined dominance. So when you didn't shout, didn't snap back, didn't play their petty little games, they assumed you were fragile. They mistook your gentleness for weakness, your calm for submission, your silence for shame. But silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And calm isn't compliance, it's calibration. You weren't adjusting yourself to fit their fantasy of control. You were aligned to a deeper intelligence. What they failed to see was the force field around your stillness. They thought power had to perform, but you were embodying a law of spiritual physics. The more potent the energy, the less it needs to announce itself. Have you ever seen a person so composed that it made others uncomfortable? Why does quiet confidence shake people louder than screaming rage? Why do insecure souls interpret self-restraint as weakness? Why do people think they can poke the calmest one in the room and get away with it? In Isaiah 53:7, it is written of the Messiah, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter." That was not powerlessness. That was prophecy moving in stealth. And like that, you chose silence not because you were scared, but because you were saturated with purpose. They talked over you because they couldn't reach within you. They paraded their noise because they didn't possess your substance. And when they saw you still standing, unmoved, unbothered, unshaken, they began to sense something ancient in your energy, something they couldn't manipulate, something they couldn't mimic. Jane Goodall, the primatologist who revolutionized the way the world understood animal intelligence, was once mocked by male academics for her quiet demeanor and lack of formal scientific tone. She didn't argue. She observed. She didn't yell. She listened. And decades later, her work transformed primatology, while many of her critics were forgotten footnotes in history. Her silence wasn't a lack of voice. It was the roar of legacy in slow motion. Compare that to Martin Shkreli, former pharmaceutical executive, who infamously raised the price of a life-saving drug by over 5,000% overnight and mocked criticism with smugness and sarcasm. He believed volume, arrogance, and media manipulation equaled power, but what began as dominance ended in disgrace. Convicted on multiple counts of fraud, he lost his company, reputation, and freedom. His name became synonymous with cruelty wrapped in confidence, proof that arrogance always ages poorly under divine time. Why do illusions collapse when truth enters the room, even silently? Why does the dignity of one person silence the chaos of many? Why do people who once laughed begin to reflect when they realize the quiet one they mocked was the one holding the mirror? Take Mara Jennings, an unassuming team coordinator who was overlooked and undervalued by her company's loud executives. When a crisis hit, data lost, clients confused, everyone panicked. Mara didn't raise her voice. She pulled up the clean backup she had quietly prepared months earlier. While others shouted, she restored. While they explained, she delivered. Leadership was never about volume. It was always about vision. Even the glass frog, almost completely translucent and barely visible to the naked eye, thrives in the dense rainforests of Central America. Its survival isn't loud or flashy. It lives undetected, protected by its stillness and transparency. But when researchers finally observe it under the right conditions, they find systems of resilience, precision, and order beating beneath its clear skin. You were like that. Quiet, overlooked, underestimated, until the moment when clarity exposed your brilliance. They underestimated you. They calculated your strength based on noise, not nucleus. But spiritual authority isn't measurable in external theatrics. It's built in frequency. And when your frequency is tuned to truth, false systems short-circuit around you. Proverbs 17:27 declares, "The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered." That verse was written with you in mind. You didn't need to bark orders or broadcast your worth. You just needed to stand. And your stand spoke in wavelengths far louder than their shouts. They expected a reaction, but encountered reflection. They wanted a fight, but witnessed a fold in their own facade. Their mockery boomeranged, their pride cracked under pressure. Because when the quiet one rises, the whole structure re-evaluates its foundation. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the spiritual bar. You didn't seek revenge. You let reality take its course. You didn't crumble. They did, under the very weight of the silence they thought meant nothing. And in the end, they realized you weren't weak. You were simply out of their algorithm, not built for their metrics, not formed in their mold. You were forged in the stillness of sacred fire. And when the heat rose, it was their illusion that melted, not your spirit. You didn't just win. You altered the entire gravitational field of their influence. You didn't clap back with venom. You rose with clarity. And that elevation caused a recalibration. They built their identity like a constellation, with themselves at the center, and you as a lesser star orbiting around their ego. But when your truth emerged, like a supernova of silent strength, the whole system destabilized. They didn't just lose you, they lost the illusion that propped them up. What happens when someone's confidence was never rooted in character, but in comparison? What happens when their glow was just your light bouncing off their mask? They thought tearing you down would crown them, that mocking you would magnetize attention, that diminishing your worth would increase theirs. But their strategy had a flaw. It depended on your silence and submission, and when you stopped orbiting their insecurity, they lost gravity. In Luke 6:45, Jesus said, "Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks," and their words were never innocent. Every joke had venom, every compliment came with a hook. They wrapped poison in pretty paper, thinking no one would notice. But the truth has a frequency that never flatlines. It hums through the air until something shatters. Have you noticed how those who once sat close to them now sit quieter? Why do group chats suddenly go silent after their outburst? Why do mutual friends seem more reserved, more hesitant, more absent? Because when masks slip, people don't always confront you. They just stop co-signing. They exit quietly. They pull their energy back like the tide before a divine tsunami. Look at the fall of Ellen DeGeneres, once seen as the queen of daytime TV, beloved, witty, untouchable. But when reports of a toxic workplace culture began to surface, the silence grew deafening. Crew members, staff, and even fans pulled back. Not all at once, but wave by wave. What was once applause turned into awkward observation. The brand didn't explode, it eroded. That's how influence truly collapses, not with scandal, but with revelation. Meanwhile, Clarence Ip, a quiet executive in a mid-sized logistics firm, endured years of being subtly sidelined by a louder, flashier manager named Brandt. Brandt built his power through bravado, public charm, private control. But when a merger audit came through, Clarence's quiet consistency, meticulous records, and humble leadership became the standard. The company restructured. Brandt was demoted. Clarence didn't celebrate. He simply kept building. He altered the current, not with noise, but with integrity. You did that too. You shifted things. You changed the climate, not with a speech, but with frequency. When energy rises, things built on instability tremble. You didn't yell. You didn't demand. You just stopped shrinking. And that subtle movement sent shockwaves through every dynamic that depended on your silence to survive. In nature, this phenomenon is mirrored in the moon jellyfish. It moves almost imperceptibly, pulsing in and out of flow, but its presence alters entire marine ecosystems. Water currents shift around it. Predators navigate differently because of it. It doesn't fight for dominance. It creates conditions where fake strength can't thrive. Have you ever wondered why their circle feels thinner now? Why they keep looking over their shoulder as if trying to track a threat that never declared war? Why their laugh doesn't hit the same, even to their own ears? Because exposure doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through contrast. And your rise was a mirror that revealed everything they tried to disguise. Romans 2:16 speaks of the day when God will judge people's secrets through Jesus Christ. But sometimes that judgment starts early, through the conviction of a clean life standing next to a counterfeit one. You didn't throw shade, you shined, and their darkness became obvious by comparison. Why do people text them differently now? Why did the same ones who once hyped them now send dry responses? Why did the invitations stop? Why is the silence so loud? Because people are spiritual beings. They sense when something's off, even when they can't name it. The collapse wasn't public, it was orbital. Their influence didn't shatter, it shrank. And for someone addicted to applause and attention, that's a type of wilderness they never prepared to navigate. You didn't destroy them, you just stopped orbiting them, and that was enough. Enough to unravel the systems they built around image, dominance, and curated charm. Enough to dislodge their false authority. Enough to show the room what real power looks like. Calm, anchored, unwavering. You became a gravitational shift, a silent awakening, and now the fallout is still echoing. Not as gossip, but as distance. You didn't just win. You destabilized a false kingdom and made space for something real to rise in its place. They weren't just embarrassed, they were spiritually disrobed. This wasn't a stumble or a social hiccup, this was divine exposure, a complete unveiling of what had been hidden beneath charm, posture, and performative power. The room didn't just witness a mistake, it witnessed a revelation. What fell wasn't their status. What collapsed was the illusion they had been surviving on for years. For so long, they had built their presence like a theatrical set, impressive from the front, hollow from behind. They had studied how to sound wise, how to mimic spiritual language, how to posture like a leader. Their aura was rehearsed, their power was borrowed, their words were second-hand. But when the atmosphere shifted, everything they once used to control the room lost its grip. Why? Because truth carries weight, and when it lands, false constructs can't hold up under its pressure. Have you ever watched someone unravel in real time, not physically but energetically? Have you felt the chill in the room when pretense finally breaks? Why is it that silence feels louder after exposure? Why does the soul react so viscerally to spiritual collapse? Job 26:13 says, "By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent." God doesn't always bring down empires with a roar. Sometimes he uses a whisper, a glance, a shift in presence, and the serpent of falsehood is pierced. That's what happened here. The breath of truth entered the room, and it dismantled everything. They thought they were in control, but what they had was momentum built on manipulation. Their confidence was costume, their authority a fabrication, and in a moment, without warning, light hit their image just at the right angle, and the shadow behind it expanded. They couldn't redirect it. They couldn't recover it, because the room had already spiritually recalibrated. Carlos Mendes, a celebrity spiritual advisor who built a following online with polished words and stage-lit sermons, was once heralded as a modern-day prophet. But when multiple former assistants revealed abusive control behind the scenes, intimidation, financial manipulation, emotional gaslighting, his followers didn't erupt in outrage. They went quiet. Slowly, partnerships vanished, bookings were cancelled, and worst of all for him, reverence died. That's the power of truth. It doesn't scream. It empties the room. In contrast, Neria Okafor, a soft-spoken community elder in Lagos, never wore titles or sought stage lights. But when a natural disaster struck her region, it was her wisdom, preparation, and quiet faith that preserved dozens of families. She didn't need a platform. Her integrity created gravity. People followed not because of appearance, but because her presence radiated something real. And Marcus Yeo, a mid-level office manager in Sydney, always kept to himself. His co-worker Greg, loud and attention-seeking, often mocked Marcus in meetings, masking digs as jokes, cutting him off mid-presentation, rallying others with fake charisma. It worked for a while, until HR quietly promoted Marcus to a regional leadership role after anonymous peer reviews praised his calm, problem-solving, work ethic, and humility. Greg didn't get demoted. But something worse happened. People stopped laughing. The applause dried up. The mask cracked. And Greg? He's still showing up, but no one's following him anymore. And nature reflects this divine unveiling. The mantis shrimp, a small sea creature, possesses the most complex vision known to science, seeing polarized light and detecting realities invisible to the human eye. When it perceives deception in another creature, it doesn't charge. It simply adjusts its position to reveal the predator's silhouette in full. You did the same. You didn't expose them with noise. You simply stood in truth, and light did the rest. Why did their voice shake after years of dominance? Why couldn't they make eye contact anymore? Why did once devoted allies now hesitate to repost their words, reshare their image, repeat their praise? Because exposure doesn't need a press conference. It only needs a shift in spiritual frequency. Romans 13:12 says, "The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light." But when someone refuses to shift from costume to character, the light doesn't bless, it blinds. They weren't just caught, they were confronted by truth's radiance, and truth never flatters. They weren't merely embarrassed, they were divinely interrupted. The kind of disruption that doesn't just break rhythm, it shatters illusion. They weren't spiritually bankrupt, they were spiritually counterfeit. Their empire wasn't built on stone. It was built on echo chambers, attention economies, and fear-based admiration. And now that echo is gone. The applause is muted. The DMs are cold. The invitations stopped, not out of offense, but out of discernment. No one wants to sit in the shadow of something that can't hold its own light. You didn't strip them, the light did. And when the light reveals, it doesn't ask permission. You stood still, and truth moved through you like electricity. And in that moment, they weren't a giant. They were a projection glitching in the presence of something authentic. And everyone in the room felt it. They weren't defeated by you. They were defeated by the reality they refused to live in. You didn't steal their power. You simply stood long enough for everyone to realize they never had any. That's the twist they weren't ready for. They expected conflict, manipulation, retaliation, some grand display of spiritual warfare. But instead, what did you do? You stayed aligned. You walked in truth. You moved in quiet clarity. And without lifting a single verbal weapon, you dismantled a throne built on illusion. What happens when someone's influence is built entirely on perception? What do you call a crown made of cardboard, polished daily but hollow underneath? They projected authority, but you carried substance. And the more you refused to play by their ego's script, the more their stage began to fall apart, one prop at a time. In 1 Corinthians 4:20, Paul writes, "For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power." That's what they missed. Their volume had no voltage, their threats had no throne, their posture was just theater. And when truth walked into the room wearing silence and stability, their borrowed strength began to dissolve. Have you ever watched a person panic? Not because you attacked, but because you didn't flinch. Why do illusions collapse when you stop reacting? Why does false authority tremble in the face of calm resistance? Because power is not proven by domination, it is revealed by depth. Take Amanda Gorman, the youngest inaugural poet in US history. She didn't scream her power. She spoke it, elegantly, intelligently, fearlessly. Some tried to diminish her youth or question her credentials, but her presence, her words, her poise dismantled the room. She didn't come to fight. She came to stand, and because she stood, every false assumption around her began to fracture. On the opposite side of that truth stands Dan Bilzerian, a social media personality who branded himself as a symbol of extreme wealth, masculinity, and dominance. With flashy jets, luxury yachts, and a curated lifestyle of excess, he attracted millions. But when reports emerged that much of his image was funded by debt and investor money, not independent success, the illusion faltered. What people thought was power turned out to be performance. The empire didn't crumble in one day, it just stopped convincing people. And once the perception vanished, so did the influence. And then there's Lyra Tran, a quiet Vietnamese accountant in a tech startup. She never raised her voice in meetings, never interrupted, never postured. Her manager often dismissed her insights until one day, when the company faced a financial crisis. It was Lyra's quietly compiled reports, years of invisible diligence and clarity of conscience that saved the firm. The manager who once appeared untouchable let go. Not because Lyra exposed him, but because truth eventually doesn't need an introduction. It arrives and shifts everything. In nature, this principle reigns. The red-crowned crane is revered not for aggression, but for presence. It stands still in flooded fields, barely moving, yet its balance and grace affect the behavior of every creature around it. Predators slow, flocks shift course. You were like that. You didn't dominate. You calibrated the field by existing in divine alignment. Why do pretenders panic when you don't respond to provocation? Why do manipulators grow loud when their hold begins to slip? Why does the crowd start to question them only after you begin to shine without explanation? Because false influence depends on contrast, and once the real thing shows up, the counterfeit can't survive the comparison. They thought their flashiness equaled favor, that their social pull equaled divine backing. But divine authority isn't proven in applause, it's proven in pressure. And when the pressure came, they cracked. Not because of what you said, but because of what you carried. Psalm 21:11 declares, "Though they plot evil against you and devise wicked schemes, they cannot succeed." And now you see why. Not because you had to crush them, but because the very idea that they had power was a lie held together by collective illusion. And once that illusion broke, even their allies could no longer pretend to believe it. You didn't retaliate. You resonated. You didn't strike back. You stood firm. And that vibration, pure, unyielding, holy, shook the systems they built. They lost not because you tore anything down, but because nothing was ever really there to begin with. The power they flaunted was social fog, propped up by misperception and spiritual immaturity. And when the light hit it, it evaporated instantly. That's why the fallout feels like bankruptcy. Not financial, but spiritual. The curtain was pulled back, and what stood behind it was not a wizard, but a whimper, a shadow trying to cast itself as a sun. And now, with no stage left, no script that works, no crowd to feed off, they face the truth. The emperor never had clothes. You didn't defeat them, you revealed the vacancy. And in that silence, that shift, that soft dismantling of their image, heaven whispered, "This is not exposure, this is divine correction, and it is complete." They laughed first, but now you're the one standing clean, calm, and crowned. No blood on your hands, no dirt under your nails, no venom in your voice. They thought your name was free entertainment, a punchline for their performance. And for a while, the crowd agreed. They cracked jokes in confidence, treated you like a stepping stone, and broadcasted their mockery like a live stream of pride. But what they didn't understand, what they still can't comprehend, is that righteousness doesn't need to shout to shake a room. Integrity doesn't need to retaliate to trigger collapse. What made you dangerous wasn't how you fought, it was how you didn't. They came with noise, but you held the room with stillness. And that stillness wasn't silence, it was strategy. Have you ever noticed how the loudest ones always expect the loudest response? Why do they flinch when you don't flinch? Why does your peace provoke their panic? Why does restraint rattle the insecure more than rage? Proverbs 26:27 says, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them." That's not just poetic justice, it's divine law. And they broke it by building platforms out of your pain. What they didn't see coming was that mockery doesn't multiply status, it subtracts character. And eventually, the echo chamber collapsed. They wanted your reaction to validate their relevance, but you gave them stillness, and that stillness became their undoing. The tongue they used to tear you down became the match that lit their own public unraveling. It wasn't thunder that took them out. It was consequence on delay, and when it landed, it didn't knock. It roared in silence. Remember Job? A man mocked in ashes, ridiculed by friends who claimed to know God, yet held his integrity through every accusation. In Job 42:10 it says, "The Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before." That's you now, the one they laughed at first, the one who didn't clap back, but got elevated anyway. You didn't have to fight dirty because truth fought for you, and truth has reach. It echoes louder than rumors, it travels farther than shade, and when it lands, it repositions everything. Take Malala Yousafzai, a young girl shot for daring to be educated. Her attackers laughed first, thinking violence would silence her. But now she stands, Nobel Prize in hand, global influence in voice, while the ideology that tried to erase her is now globally condemned. Her comeback wasn't powered by bitterness, it was framed in stillness, and that's what made it divine. Now contrast that with Logan Paul, once known more for mockery than merit. When he filmed and posted content so disrespectful, it turned global celebration into collective shame. The internet turned cold. Brands backed away. Fans reconsidered. His image didn't collapse because someone cancelled him. It collapsed because his own choices did the heavy lifting. That's what they never understand. When you build attention on exploitation, the spotlight eventually turns on you. And then there's Joaquin Morales, a bakery assistant who rarely spoke up at staff meetings. His co-worker Leo made sport of mocking him in front of others, calling him slow, soft, useless. For months, no one said a word, until the health inspection came. It was Joaquin's detailed logs and quiet diligence that saved the bakery from closure. Leo was let go, and Joaquin quietly promoted, not because he exposed anyone, but because truth, when left alone, always testifies in time. In nature, the owl hunts best in silence. Its wings are structured with special serrations that break up turbulence, making its flight nearly inaudible. While other birds flap for dominance, the owl dominates the night, not by noise, but by design. That's you. You didn't rise by screaming. You rose by being built for the moment others fumbled. Why did the room shift without a word? Why did people stop laughing one by one? Why did their allies grow quiet when no one attacked them? Why do their own words sound different now, even to themselves? Because exposure doesn't require a headline. It only requires contrast, and your grace became the mirror. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath." You did exactly that. And God didn't just protect your name, He purified your legacy. You're not holding grudges, you're holding ground. And your peace? It has a pulse that cannot be manufactured. They expected you to play the game. You rewrote the rules by refusing to play at all, and that refusal embarrassed them, not because you mocked them back, but because you showed the room who they really were. They didn't lose to you. They collapsed under the weight of their own character. So here you are, unshaken, untouched, unmatched. No blood on your hands, no regrets on your path. And while they scramble to salvage their image, you're already walking in restoration. You didn't fight ugly. You stood in truth. And that truth became fire and consumed every lie built in your name. This wasn't just a public shift. It was a spiritual reckoning. And the silence they hear now, that's not awkwardness. It's aftermath. So now you understand. It wasn't about proving your worth to the crowd. It wasn't about clapping back or putting on a show. It was about letting heaven speak louder than your flesh ever could. And when the arrogant one finally ran out of breath and their ego deflated in front of everyone, it wasn't your volume that won the room. It was your vibration. The atmosphere shifted not because you shouted, but because you stood in sacred stillness. That's the sound of a mantle speaking for itself. You didn't just silence a clown, you revealed the spirit behind the mask. And you didn't need revenge, you carried revelation. You didn't need applause, you carried authority. And now that the dust has settled, they're not laughing anymore. Because truth doesn't need a mic drop, it is the mic drop. If this message stirred something in your soul, if you've ever been laughed at, dismissed, or underestimated, then this word was for you. Like this video, if it reminded you of your power. Comment 777 below if you've ever had a moment when heaven defended you in front of your enemies. Share this message with someone who's been in the fire but refused to burn. Let them know the ones who mocked you will have to witness your miracle, and their pride will collapse in the presence of your quiet strength. To every single one of you who's supported this journey, whether through super thanks, prayer, encouragement, or simply showing up, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Whether you gave or not, whether you just found this channel or you've been here from the beginning, your presence is seen, your spirit is valued, and your story still matters. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a word that might just unlock your next breakthrough. This community was built for warriors like you, those who fight battles in silence and walk out victories with grace. The world may not always understand you, but heaven has always known your name. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his justice rise on your behalf and his peace surround you like a shield. May your enemies be silenced not by your anger, but by your elevation. And may your next move not be loud, but legendary. You silenced the mockery. Now walk boldly into your mantle.